Welcome to Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm Erin Gowriluk, the president of the Canada Grains Council and your host. This podcast serves as a platform to explore grain sector priorities that reflect the Council's work here at home and around the world. Together, we will discuss issues and ideas with policymakers and industry influencers. And today's conversation is focused on issues that we'd like to hear more from our political leaders about as they make their way across the country in an effort to secure your vote. And joining me today is quite a lineup. It's not often that we have a panel on the pod, and a power panel at that. Joining me is Tyler McCann, who is the Managing Director of the Nonpartisan Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, CAPI. While currently in a nonpartisan role, his career in agri-food policy and politics includes working for the most recent Conservative Agriculture Minister and working on national and local campaigns. He has also worked for farm groups, industry associations, and agri-food businesses. Tyler operates a beef and goat farm with his wife and kids in Western Quebec. Carlo Dade, probably one of the only guests who has been on the podcast twice now. Carlo recently joined the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy as the new Director of International Policy. And Carlo has extensive background in international public policy, having most recently served as the founder and director of the Trade and Trade Infrastructure Policy Research Centre at the Canada-U.S. Foundation. Among other accomplishments, he contributed significantly to the development of the National Trade Infrastructure Plan and the renewal of Canada's trade corridors. Widely recognized as a leading voice on defending and advancing Western Canadian trade interests, Carlo is a frequent media commentator who has played a pivotal role in shaping trade strategies that safeguard economic stability and growth. His expertise is particularly crucial in the trade relationships between Canada and the United States as they face some significant challenges. And finally, Nick McRoberts is an account director at Hill & Knowlton. He is a seasoned leader in communications, branding, and public affairs. Originally from Prince Edward Island, he holds a Bachelor of Social Sciences with a joint honors in public administration and political science from the University of Ottawa. And he has previously worked with the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food and the Minister of Veterans Affairs. Nick is a sought-after thought leader and has also been recognized by the Canadian Agri-Food Marketers Alliance for his work in supporting multiple initiatives in Canadian agriculture. Gentlemen, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, indeed.
Thanks, Erin.
So I am soon going to invite all three of you to respond to yesterday's announcement. We are recording today's episode on Thursday, April 3rd, the day after American Liberation Day. You're joining us from the United States this week, Carlos. I'm sure you'll provide a unique perspective on that. But before we get there, I'm going to start with a question that inspired today's episode, and that was a conversation, Tyler, between you and I a week or two ago. You had a pretty strong reaction to my suggestion that in light of what's happening with our largest trading partner, the United States, that I thought maybe one of Mark Carney's first acts as Prime Minister ought to be lifting the tariffs on Chinese EVs in an effort to restore diplomatic relations between Canada and China and facilitate some type of conversation toward some type of trade agreement between the two countries. What are your thoughts on that, Tyler?
So I think, Erin, often in agriculture, we think that we live in agriculture and that is kind of what drives the agenda and that's how we should think about things. But clearly today we're in a world where more and more countries are playing different geopolitical games and we need to understand how agriculture fits in the big picture. And this isn't, I think it's just wildly inappropriate to think about this in the context of canola exports to China versus EV jobs in Southern Ontario. I think that this is really about what is our relationship with the United States versus what is our relationship with China. And I don't think that there is an easy situation or an easy solution. And I think especially in light of what we saw yesterday, it's critically important that we understand that anything that we do with China has ramifications in Washington. And we need to take a much more balanced, thoughtful approach than often we hear people suggesting.
Thanks, Tyler. Carlo, do you agree?
So I agree that the situation is complex, and I agree that there are no easy solutions. I would also agree that we need to think about agriculture in the broader context. However, I was in Beijing few months ago at the Ministry of Commerce, actually suggesting that the Chinese make the first offer to us in terms of opening up and lowering the tariffs. We are, as Tyler mentioned, playing a very complex game nowadays, but it's one in which the rules have drastically shifted vis-a-vis the U.S. Our confidence in the U.S., the facts and evidence on which to base a policy of engagement and trade with the U.S. have shifted drastically. I would argue that China has made significant moves to open its economy. The zeroing out of tariffs recently on least developed countries, the same week that the U.S. was threatening 100% tariff on the BRICS. The work that China's taken in terms of increasing global infrastructure to move agricultural goods. All this has positive and negative impacts on us. The reality is we have to engage China just as we have to engage the U.S. I think the more cards we have in our hands, the better our negotiating position. But having cards does not necessarily mean playing the cards. And I think that's where Tyler and I would disagree. I think we need more cards in our hands. We need to engage China. They're unavoidable. It's the world's second largest economy. As we said at Canada-U.S., even if you run away from China, you're going to run into China, in Brazil, in Indonesia. So we have to keep the negotiations with China open. I suggest that should include talking to them about canola. I wouldn't put it in the context of EVs necessarily, but indeed, that is what happened to us. Canola was thrown under the electric vehicle bus, and I don't think we can avoid that reality. I see Tyler's chiming to get.
Yeah, because Carlo,
go back in.
Because I think that the challenge is that this isn't about do we engage with China or not, or do we drop tariffs or not. I'm not saying we don't engage with China. I'm saying that we need to have a much more thoughtful understanding about the consequences of these decisions and the reasons why governments don't. And I often have been lately trying to remind farmers in Western Canada that Pierre Poilievre called for these tariffs to be put in place a month before the government actually did it. And so from a partisan political perspective, it's also important to understand kind of it's not just complex geopolitics. The politics on this are pretty complicated too.
Agreed.
We're not done with China. Trust me, gents. We'll be back. But I do quickly want to get a reaction from you, Carlo, because today is April 3rd and yesterday, April 2nd, the United States was liberated through the introduction of widespread tariffs applied to all goods essentially entering into the United States. But some are suggesting that Canada has been spared to a certain extent, at least from further tariffs, because steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs still apply. And otherwise, we're facing a 10% tariff on all USMCA non-compliant goods. So what's your reaction to yesterday's announcement? And can you speak to what you think the impact of this is going to be for both the Canadian and the American economy?
Well, that would take up the rest of the podcast and two more. But briefly, I'm still working my halfway through the White House executive order. So I'm still working my way through the information and we're gaining clarity the day after. I would note that it's not clear. Canada and Mexico were subject to tariffs first, and we received a reprieve. So it's not clear, and the reprieve then moved to goods that aren't covered by the CUSMA agreement. But it's like the first round of steel and aluminum tariffs from the first Trump administration. Those were never entirely taken off. If you read the agreement to pause the first steel and aluminum tariffs, the words used end, stop, cease, but the end of that agreement said the tariffs on steel and aluminum could return if certain ill-defined conditions were met, a surge past historic norms over a certain period. None of those terms, surge, historic norms, were defined. So I would argue that one of the reasons we were quote unquote spared is because we were already taken care of, according to the Trump administration. That's my current working thesis. It's likely to change as I read more. But we still have the threat of tariffs hanging over our head. I'm calling it the tweet of Damocles. Trump issues a tweet that they're coming back, and well, there goes our confidence. There goes our feeling that we escaped the first round. So I don't know that we've entirely escaped. I wouldn't use escaped the first. That's my first choice. I think the attention has just shifted to other countries, but that doesn't mean we're out of the line of fire. We're off the firing range.
Okay. Thanks, Carlo. Nick, I want to bring you into the discussion, and I want to get some reaction to how the Canadian government is responding. I know they're kind of in the process of responding to yesterday's announcement. So maybe, Nick, you could reflect not only on the response that they've issued in the last several hours, but maybe overall, how has Prime Minister Carney responded to Trump? And to that, I would add, out of curiosity, I'd love to get your reaction on Trump's treatment of Carney by comparison to because what was it, a week and a half ago now, Trump and Carney had a call, and Trump went on to say on Truth Social that he felt that the interaction was extremely productive, and he referred to Mark Carney as the Prime Minister. And so I'd love to know from your perspective, is it Carney, or are we turning over a new leaf here from Trump's perspective? Is there an opportunity now to hit the reset button? I'd love to get your perspective on those two issues, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think what we're seeing from the Canadian government is a response that's rooted not in responding to tweets and speeches and rhetoric, but one that is now pivoting to responding directly to those executive orders that we mentioned. There's no sense, and I think we've seen this both in the U.S., domestically in Canada, and internationally, there's no sense in responding to, a 2 a.m. tweet from the president or something that he says outside of his remarks at a press release or a press event, but rather responding directly to what is written in an executive order and what will be followed through. And that's why last night, we really didn't see much from the Prime Minister. We saw him, give some comments at his ins to the cabinet meeting. And we'll get a more fulsome response today. He has floated that will include countermeasures, is the term that they're using. They're trying to stay clear away from using the word counter tariffs. And so it points to this needing to be nimble in your response and needing to not govern based on what CNN is reporting or what Bloomberg is reporting or what CBC is reporting, and governing purely from the facts. That seems maybe overstated or reductionist, but it's the reality that we're faced with a president that is so impulsive. And I've heard from people that are directly in calls with senior Canadian officials and the White House or the Prime Minister and the President that Donald Trump is solely focused on the last thing that someone said to him. And so to get to your point, Erin, on is this Carney or is this Trudeau, it's the fact that it's not Trudeau is what's making the relationship seem more positive. But it's also probably the fact that someone has given him a 10-minute briefing on who's Mark Carney. He's heard the word, banker, an economist, and he goes, I like this guy, and I'm going to, call him the Prime Minister, which is scary that we're at a place that the bar is so low that we're all, pleased that our Prime Minister is being referred to as the Prime Minister.
Okay, so he's going to give him a chance. We'll see how he responds to him maybe after these reciprocal measures are put in place, what he thinks of that. So maybe, Nick, one last question before we come back once more to the North American context and as it relates to China for one final question. With respect to the government's response, what matters more now in the lead up to the election as far as the electorate is concerned? Are they thinking more about how Canada is going to respond to Trump or how leaders articulate their support for the affected sectors?
It's a bit of a cop-out, but they are similarly important, just because they speak to two different sections of the electorate, right? When you talk about responding to Trump, that's speaking to the everyday voter, maybe someone that's not engaged in an industry directly, not involved in an industry association, wants to wrap themselves in the flag, is unsure where the world's going to. That's who that messaging is speaking to. When you start talking about measures to protect industry, that's talking to unions, that's talking to agricultural producers, that's talking to ranchers, that's talking to other levels of government. And so finding the balance there is what we're going to continue to see throughout the campaign. But the one insight I will say is that this election really is going to be fought and won in the Windsor to Quebec City corridor. That is a huge economic driver in Canada, from agricultural processing to dairy to farms in southwestern Ontario, steel in Hamilton, cars in Windsor. So they have to strike a balance between communicating to Canadians on the coasts or in the prairies that might want to hear more about that wrapping themselves in the flag Canadiana messaging, and then spending their time actually speaking to industry that's affected and showcasing the measures that they're putting in place. It's not a job that I envy.
Thanks, Nick. So I want to come back to trade for just a moment before we start talking more about the political and policy commitments that are or are not being made in the lead up to the election at the end of this month. Tyler, in the CAPI webinar that you hosted last week with Sean Haney, and great lineup, by the way, you referenced this concept. I think it was you who referenced the concept of Fortress North America. And first, I want to know if that's even a realistic objective at this point. And I think today's the first day we can reasonably have that conversation, now that we have a better sense of what we're going to be subjected to, at least in the near term. And how a unified North American trade strategy could, in your view, better position the region to navigate shifting Chinese cultural or agricultural demand or potential trade tensions?
I think that we may have seen yesterday a commitment to Fortress North America. I think if you look at the exemption for our USMCA trading partners, the Americans have taken a step in that direction. I think it's still far too early to tell how big of a step that they've taken at the end of the day and how serious this commitment is to protecting North American trade. The tariffs on autos speak to kind of a lack of seriousness at the end of the day, but it creates this interesting opportunity. We've spent the last couple of months talking about the importance of trade diversification, and I really wonder how much of the pressure's been taken off that pedal, given what we saw yesterday. And there may be an argument in a lot of places that actually we need to now double down on the US market because we have a 10, 20, or 30% tariff advantage potentially against other parties exporting into the United States. And so I think that there's going to be a long time before the dust settles. And I think that there's this, as Carlo referred to, this reality that heaven only knows when all of this will change. And all of a sudden, the North American approach that was taken yesterday is upended by the president saying something else at the end of the day. But it's the unpredictability of the US position on everything makes all of this more difficult. I do think that there's a strong argument to be made for Canada and Mexico working much more closely together, certainly in the North American context, but also in the global context as well. And I think in the past, the Prime Minister Trudeau seemed to be less interested in kind of that approach and matching the Mexican approach than Prime Minister Carney does. And I think it kind of speaks to, it's hard to know what the Liberal Party today and what the current government stands for, given how different on a lot of these things it was from what the government of 3 weeks ago stood for. But I do get the sense that there's more of an interest in working more closely with Mexico at the end of the day.
Before we shift gears, Carlo, anything more to say with respect to yesterday's announcement, Fortress North America, China, your favorite topics?
Yeah, unfortunately, and we brought in Mexico too, so I've got the trifecta. In just a couple of quick notes, in terms of Nick's comment about the shift from Trudeau to Carney, I would also note that the antipathy between former Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump was also personal. I think we tend to forget just how personal it was. We had the President of the United States making comments about the Prime Minister of Canada's mother. It wasn't just the trolling on the 51st state or the little Justin comments. When you sink to that level, it speaks, especially for someone from Queens, to talk about your mother in the U.S. context, and I grew up in the Northeast. It has that to me was the signal that there was a heck of a lot more going on here. How deep the personal antipathy was. So certainly when Trudeau moves along, Trump's going to see that as a victory, and he'll, unless the incoming prime minister is going out of his or her way to really cheese off Trump, things are going to be better, and we're taking advantage of that. The other point is, preparation. The government is still on its back foot. Preparations for these tariffs needed to have started in March when Trump seized the GOP nomination. We knew that the probability of tariffs were significant enough. Trump up in the polls, looked like he was going to win. We should have begun the preparations we're rushing to do now. And at some point in time, I think there will be a reckoning in Canada for why we completely misread the situation. And we did. Consistently willful ignorance in terms of ignoring what was happening in the US and choosing not to prepare. We chose to engage to try and prevent the tariffs, but we didn't do the other half of the work, which was taking it seriously that they would occur. Our attempts to prevent them would fail, and to take measures within Canada to prepare. And that's what we're rushing to do now with the announcements. But that gets us to Fortress North America. We're looking at generational change in the US. This isn't just another 198 weeks of the Trump administration. What comes next from the Democrats? What happens is, I think, the America First movement is about to destroy itself, civil war. We're looking at generational change in the US. If, as Tyler says, we are going to have to increase in the US, we're going to have to get smarter about how we engage. And few things would scare me more than going deeper into the US if we're not prepared, if we haven't rethought how we engage, if we haven't invested in understanding the new US and the capacity to follow the generational change and to make sense of it, so we don't repeat the mistakes we just made by ignoring all the signals that were coming out in advance of the Trump administration. We're not going to leave the US. Country, we've tried for 50 years to diversify. We started 1971, the last time the Americans surprised us with an across-the-board tariff and scared us to death. And we haven't moved out of the US market. So while there may be some diversification, I think it'll be marginal. We're going to be in the US, and we're going to have to get smarter about the US, the same way we have to get smarter about China.
And I think, Erin, that point about the lack of preparation and the need for a reckoning is really important. And I think it's not a partisan statement to say that the government was woefully unprepared and did not take this issue seriously. And I think if you look at what we saw within 1 week of a new agriculture minister, Cody Blois, they rushed announcements out on the Saturday night before the election call. Part of the reason that happened is because they started from scratch effectively the week before when the minister was appointed. It is, I think, a bit mind-boggling to try and understand what happened in the months following the election, or what didn't happen in the months following the election. And I think that, again, we've got a new prime minister, we've got a new cabinet, effectively a new Liberal Party today, it seems, even though so many of them are the same. But that reckoning is needed because they have put the country in a far weaker position because of the lack of preparedness that Carlo talked about.
And it's provincial too, so it's not just the feds. I think Alberta's recovered the fastest in terms of trying to understand the new US, talking to the America First movement, but still, it was across the board, and it was willful, I think. It was willful on our part not to read the signs, not to take them seriously, not to talk to the America First movement, not to endorse them. But it's your job to defend and advance Canadian interest. You've got to talk to people who pose a potential threat to the country. So yeah, that day of reckoning, I wrote about that in the FP, and I'm going to stand by that. I could be wrong. Maybe 5-10 years from now, there's an oral history produced, or documents are released. But the facts and evidence that we have are that we weren't prepared, and I'll stand by that until someone introduces new facts to correct that view.
This is a good discussion. I hate to interrupt. We're going to switch gears because we have an election coming up in 3 weeks from now. So let's talk a bit about some of the commitments that have been made or haven't been made in the lead up to the election as it relates to the agriculture industry. So let's turn to some of the policy commitments that parties have made as they relate to our industry. I want to start with the Conservatives, who until very recently, when they introduced their Boots Not Suits campaign, were reminding us that they were very much committed to axing the tax, but this time they're going after the industrial carbon tax. So Tyler, does this matter to anyone? And if so, who?
The industrial carbon tax, it certainly matters to some Canadian businesses that are impacted by it. The reality is that it may matter in as much as it's taking away and companies have invested in order to comply with it. And so it may disrupt business planning perspectives, but I think what matters the most at any situation, and again, it's amplified by what we're seeing in the United States, is the uncertainty that comes with this. Again, I think that there was this sense that regardless of what happened with the consumer carbon tax, the industrial carbon tax would survive. It was something that was had survived the provincial governments in Alberta changing. It survived governments in Saskatchewan as well. Conservative governments had left that industrial carbon tax in place. But clearly, after the Liberals started to dance on the grave of the consumer carbon tax, the Conservatives needed something else to carve a niche out in the space, and this is what was available for them.
Okay, so again, what else the conservatives need, though, because they're down in the polls, certainly by comparison to where they were. What is it that they need to be laser focused on right now if they want to attempt to recover some of those numbers in the next 2 to 3 weeks, in your view?
But so let's keep in mind, I mean, I think the polls may be shifting a little bit in the last day or two, but the Conservatives have historically been high compared to where they were. The Conservative polling average at the beginning of the campaign is higher than it was in 2011 when Stephen Harper won his majority. The issue is not a collapsing Conservative vote. The issue is that the NDP outside of Quebec has imploded. And in Quebec, the Bloc is on the verge of, or is heading in that direction, it seems. And so, you know, the reality is that it is hard for a Conservative party to win government when the NDP's at single digits, like, you know, on the verge of approaching 5%. And so it just changes the electoral landscape and it makes things different. And so I think ultimately what the Conservatives need to do to win is to remind NDP voters of Mark Carney's background and remind NDP voters of what Mark Carney has stood for and how he made his millions that we don't really know about because of the lack of transparency there. But the more that they can do that, and the more that they can point out that effectively Mark Carney today is running on a Pierre Poilievre election platform, you know, I think that is a big part of what's needed to get a Conservative government elected.
Nick, do you disagree?
I don't. I think an additional point is, and you've seen it a little bit this week, is that Pierre Poilievre needs to pivot to Trump. Trump is the ballot question. Canada's sovereignty, these tariffs, that is what's on Canadians' minds, and that's what the ballot question is. That pivot has started to happen for sure, but the more that Canada gets these carve-outs, the less that messaging floats a little bit more with voters and stays in their head. To maybe put a finer point on what Tyler has spoken about again, and I agree as a partisan Liberal that the Liberals' fortunes are in part thanks to a collapsing NDP, but it's also in part to Mark Carney shifting the goalposts a little bit, shifting the Liberal Party back into the center and allowing a place for those kind of left or red Tories to live. The other thing, and some opinion columnists have noted this as well, is that Mark Carney is presenting an opportunity for voters to vote for a Conservative platform without being a Conservative, without being Pierre Poilievre, and coming with some of that baggage that you know, critics of the Conservative Party might talk about in terms of maybe some conspiracy theories or some more right-wing views. So the goalposts have shifted, and that allows the Liberals to be much more of a big tent party and bring in, you know, voting blocks in the island of Montreal and in southern Quebec and even, you know, in Alberta. And so, yeah, I mean, as a partisan Liberal, the more the NDP can, you know, fall on their feet, the better. But the Conservatives also have an opportunity here to pivot stronger than they have been.
I know I have friends and family in the province of Alberta who are going to vote for Mark Carney in the next election. I just about fell off my seat. So he does have an interesting appeal. So both Carney and Poilievre have committed to cut spending. So if we're going to, in fact, enter into a period of austerity, considering the challenges and the opportunities now facing Canada, Nick, I'll start with you. Where do you think we need to make cuts, and where should we double down? Maybe you can set the stage for us here and with a couple of examples with respect to the approaches that Carney and Poilievre have committed to taking and the effectiveness of each.
They both, in one way or the other, have talked about the size of the federal public service. Pierre talks about it in the sense of ballooning bureaucracy, and it's a bit of an Americanism, right? To talk about how many public servants we have and how many people are on the payroll and how much they're being paid, and cutting that back for efficiency. Carney has also talked about that, but in a more central banker sort of way, where he talks about operational expenditure versus investments. I think regardless, we need to see them both talking about cutting back the public service to find some of those efficiencies and those tax dollars, but also in terms of some of the more, I don't want to go so far as to say we need to cut aid in the world, especially at a time where the U.S. is stepping down. But I think there's going to be a look at some more of those Trudeau-era social programs domestically and globally, and scaling some of those back in favor of home building and a middle-class tax cut and defense spending. We're going to, again, back to that goalpost movement, see a shift away from a more left of center spending program to a much more centrist domestic investment and defense spending plan from both the Liberals and the Conservatives. The amounts are what change among the programs, or the platforms rather, but again, to Tyler's point, they're both going after the same thing.
Tyler, I know you have thoughts on this. Where do we cut back and where do we need to double down?
Well, again, I'm going to pick up Mark Carney a little bit to say that I still haven't figured out the difference between spending and investment, right? So there's this kind of saying, as much as they like to poke fun of Poilievre for slogans, the slogan of spend less, invest more, I think is something that I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around. And I think if we're talking about investments in trade infrastructure, Carlo and a lot of others would be really happy if that's the type of investments that we're making, but I'm not sure we've got clarity on that yet. I mean, it is important to highlight that, the budget of the Agriculture Department is effectively 40% bigger than it was now than in 2015, whenever the Liberals were elected. Like, there is quite a bit of additional spending that the department is doing on things. I think if you look at what, you try and read between the lines of the Liberal platform commitment that came out this week, I think that there is the sense that it is more geared towards investments, kind of talking about value-added processing, trying to encourage more of that capital investment in this country. And I think generally that's good. But I think what the federal government needs to do across the federal government is say, what are the things that only the federal government can do? What are those? How can the federal government spend money and invest money in ways that facilitates the private sector to do what it needs to do? What are the things like R&D where, if the federal government doesn't do it, nobody's going to do it. There's really basic research that there really is a strong role for government. And so I think that we need to be a lot more thoughtful about how do we make sure that government is doing the things that only government can do? And then how do we make sure government's getting out of the way and not complicating private sector growth and investment? And I think that, again, you can see a bit of that in the context of the Liberal platform. And I expect we'll see something similar from Conservatives when they release their ag platform too.
Okay, because the Conservatives, I haven't found it. They haven't released their ag platform yet, have they?
No, but it's early in a campaign, and I
Okay.
don't think that's a big surprise.
Okay, so I want to ask maybe each of you to either respond to the contents of the Liberal platform that was released, I think just yesterday or the day before, if you've had a chance to read it, and if not, maybe tell me if you held the pen on political party platforms as it relates to priorities for Canada's agriculture sector. What are the top 3 commitments that you would like to see reflected in each one of those campaign platforms? Nick, I'll start with you.
The one that jumped out to me, and again, it's kind of the same topic that we've been talking about, is the CFIA red tape reduction, whatever you want to make of that promise. I've heard throughout my time in government and in personal life, my father-in-law works at a processing facility in southwestern Ontario that gets inspected by the CFIA. It's overburdening processors. It's important, especially as we face global livestock epidemics, and making sure that our food is safe. But I'll note, Canadian food is the safest in the world, and we can step back a little bit from the CFIA overburdening those producers that just want to, do their best job. So that stepped out. I know that there's been some backlash on some of the agri-stability commitments, and some of the amounts around there. We'll see where that goes. But I mean, the priority needs to be strengthening trade corridors, in terms of both existing ones. So I agree with Carlo and Tyler that the U.S. is not a foregone conclusion, and we need to work hard to make sure that we can still have some sort of relationship with them in a North American context. But also looking at, making sure that we have an on paper actual trade agreement with the UK, and working out some of those little intricacies that we're getting stuck with. Labor access, and a long-term strategy for making sure that Canadian agriculture has the labor workforce that it needs. The other thing that's not mentioned in the platform, and it might not be one that you always hear about, but Donald Trump has talked a lot about water. He's talked a lot about water for Midwestern producers. He's talked a lot about water in California, and he's talked a lot about how that water comes from Canada. Tyler, I know this is work that CAPI has done on a national water strategy, and I think it's one that we need to be keenly focused on, both as a matter of national security and security for Canadian agriculture, as we're faced with more climate change epidemics and droughts, but also as we look at Americans eyeing our water source from the north. I think that is a critical piece that all parties and the platforms need to be focused on.
Thanks, Nick. Carlo, if you were offering advice to the political leaders in the lead up to the next election, what do you think they ought to be talking about? What commitments should they be making, in your view, at this point?
Well, thanks for pointing out that the Liberals had released a platform. I just rushed to the website, and it spent all of Nick's time trying to find it. So
gonna take a pass on this one for now, or hey, if you held the pen, what is it you'd want to see reflected in the plan?
But the point is, I did find it. It just wasn't that easy. Would be my comment there. But I noticed the trade infrastructure announcement that they're going to focus on this. This is something where not just formally at Canada-U.S, we have devoted years of deep research in partnership with the Business Council of Canada, the Canadian Chamber. There's a whole coalition nationally of business associations, think tanks, and others that have advanced a plan for trade infrastructure that was backed by the Council of the Federation and others. So here's what I find hopeful but worrisome. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, they've recognized trade enabling infrastructure, and they've done it in a way that's different than the Trudeau government did. So the Trudeau government announced they were going to focus on infrastructure. They quoted our work at Canada-U.S. And then the first announcement was housing, green infrastructure, and another category, but we had to go back and yell at them, and everyone had to yell at them to put in trade infrastructure. So this time, great. They've got specified trade infrastructure, no wiggle room. They said trade and trade corridors. Okay, but here's the problem. Their work has already been done on how to do this. That work is agreed upon by shippers, transporters, national business associations, to some extent by producers too. The worry is that the government is once again going to ignore the work that's been done, as Tyler mentioned, actually talking to people who use these assets, who actually need them, and that the Liberals are going to go back to their old tendency to simply try and reinvent the wheel and put in something larded with political announcements. The key document on the new vision of trade infrastructure is shovel worthy, not shovel ready. And the real fear here is that the Liberals are deaf to that message. So we need to see concrete evidence of the Liberals reaching out to the national coalitions, the Council of the Federation, and the work that they endorsed to take the work that's already been done and agreed upon and move it forward. But on the other hand, I've heard nothing from the Conservatives about this. We've approached them time and time again on the trade infrastructure file. They've listened to the assembled groups, but we really haven't seen them move on this or put this in a priority. So the Liberals have great potential to do good, but there's also potential to do great harm, to waste the opportunity, to waste limited resources. So I would really want to see them with more clarity on that point. And yeah, the work's been done. Should they come back and try and reinvent it, I would really fear that things would go off the track. And just a quick point. On the Conservatives, I still haven't seen any evidence that the Conservatives are ready to take over the relationship with the U.S. Deep work within the party. They were so focused on their their four slogans. And who comes up with four? Didn't they ever hear about the rule of three? I can never remember what they did because they had four instead of three. But a more serious point, I've just seen no evidence that they've invested the time, resources to be able to take over the U.S. relationship. Pierre has done well when he's had the microphone in front of him, but I just have seen no evidence, and I'm not convinced that he hasn't just gotten lucky in front of the microphone. I don't have a sense that there's something deep behind that within the party. And until they can demonstrate that, I think others are going to have questions about how ready they are to take over.
Okay, hang on to that thought. Let's circle back and have a quick closing question around leadership and what the country needs right now. But first, I want to hear from Tyler on this point. Tyler, what's your wish list?
I think that before I get to my wish list, just to say, I bet at the end of the day, you're going to see Liberal and Conservative ag platforms that are probably pretty close and pretty similar at the end of the day. And again, things like a little bit more money for risk management, a commitment to supply management, some acknowledgement about red tape and kind of competitiveness issues. I think those are all going to kind of will be seen on when the Conservatives do too. But I think that all of this is a missed opportunity. And again, I've been around politics kind of for going on 20 years, and I should be smart enough to know that bold visions and kind of ambitious plans aren't what we get in election campaigns. But boy, do we face serious issues as a country, and boy, do we face serious issues in agriculture and food. And there is an incredible need to change how we do business in this country. And there's an incredible need to change how governments work in this country. And there's an incredible need for generational change in ag policy in Canada today. And I just don't think that we're gonna see that in any of the party platforms. And what we've seen in the Liberals, and again, I expect what we'll see in the Conservatives, is kind of a little bit more of the same. And I think that that's unfortunate, and it's a missed opportunity. What we're seeing in the United States should be the wake-up call we all need for better, more ambitious outcomes. And I don't know, unfortunately, that's not the way politics seems to work these days. And I often say that as much as we can blame the parties for that, we get the governments we deserve. And I think Canadians need to do a better job demanding more from the political parties these days.
Nick, what's it going to take? What does it take to get these parties to take agriculture seriously and to think, to Tyler's point, about what's really required? A bold vision for the sector.
As a communicator, it's about storytelling, and it's about effectively getting a message in front of the right person at the right time. During an election campaign, that's every day, to the leader, about just what is at stake when you don't invest in Canadian agriculture. And it's about more than jobs. It's about more than labor shortages. It's about more than increased egg prices. It's about families and it's about communities. And messaging that to elected leaders and wanting to be elected leaders is what's at stake here. And you know, Erin, I know that you probably have a lot of ag policy experts and producers and farmers that listen to this, and when they come to your doorstep and when they ask you what's important, you know, talk about not policy and not, you know, investments and risk management. Talk about your farm. Talk about your neighbor's farm and the struggles that they've been having or the successes that they've having, the need to government to get out of the way, the need for government to invest more, because they need to tell stories about people. To Tyler's point on doing big things, people do big things, not government. And so getting government to recognize that farming, agriculture, and the sector as an economic driver, it all comes down to, you know, in my case, a potato farmer in Cornwall, PEI, or a grain grower in Western Canada. Like, it is that person that drives it, and that needs to be the message.
And I think in defense of the parties, if agriculture itself doesn't have a plan or a vision for what generational change in ag policy looks like, we can't expect the parties to have it too, right? And to Nick's point, if farmers across the country were saying the same things and saying it loudly and telling it in a way about how this matters and matters to them and matters to the country, I think that there would be an impact and there'd be a lot of potential there. But unfortunately, we as a sector don't do a very good job of that at the end of the day. And I think it makes it easy for the parties then to do kind of, here's a half dozen measures that kind of loosely fit together that maintain the status quo but don't grow the sector, and that's unfortunate. But again, that's as much our inability to go to the parties with a vision as it is the parties' inability to come to us.
We've got some work to do. I feel like that's another conversation. Potentially, we could dedicate a podcast conversation to what the sector needs to do to be more effective and more compelling in our communication to get what we want and ultimately what we deserve. But maybe before we close the conversation today, I have a personal interest in leadership, having studied the topic as part of my graduate degree. And I think that increasingly unprecedented challenges that we're facing require unprecedented leadership. So I want to close all of my conversations by asking my guests to weigh in on the topic. And my question for each of you is this. I'm going to start with you, Tyler. Policy commitments aside, let's talk leadership. Considering everything that we've talked about today, whoever gets the top job is going to be walking into an incredibly complex and challenging geopolitical environment. So what kind of leader does Canada need right now? And if you want to pull in a few examples of anything that has stood out to you with respect to the leaders in the past couple of weeks, please do.
You know, I think ultimately what Canada needs is a serious leader and a serious government. And again, I think part of the challenges that we've had is that we haven't had a very serious leader and a very serious government, but also we haven't had a very serious opposition of late. And I think that this is unfortunately the dynamics that we're in, where there almost seems to be a reward for the pithy slogan rather than a substantive response. And there hasn't been this kind of vision for what this leadership approach that takes these issues seriously. And again, I think that the Conservative Party arguably had been being rewarded in the polls for the last 18 months, in part due to Poilievre's approach and language and kind of attacks on the government and the opposition and the other opposition parties. And it is unfortunate. I think that's part of the pivot. As much as kind of a pivot about talking about U.S. issues, I think part of the pivot that he needs and that we need to see is a pivot to more serious leadership that talks seriously about the issues that are facing the country and talks seriously about the solutions that they have on offer. And I think that's part of the reason why Carney is doing so well, is because he responds to that need for serious leadership at the end of the day. But we're still early on in the campaign. I think a lot of things are changed. I think we do see some of that conservative tone and approach changing. But yeah, I think it's, in my mind, really simple, Aaron. I just want a serious government for once, and I feel like we haven't had those in about 10 years.
Carlo, anything to add in terms of the kind of leadership that Canada needs right now?
Well, to Tyler's point, I think the seriousness of the moment may force a change to more serious leadership. We don't have the luxury of being as complacent in the past. We don't have the luxury of diving into idiosyncratic whims and wishes. I would point to, say, the budget at Foreign Affairs Canada. You look, we're facing massive budget cuts in foreign affairs, but also that's a ministry responsible for trade. I was going through the, this is a bit of a side ramp, I was going through the budget and looking at the money being spent on the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Middle East strategy. The largest project budget line item was for feminist foreign policy. Can we afford that luxury? Now, folks back at the university, I'm sure I'd get an earful about how that is a priority. And there are arguments to be made, academic arguments and others to be made. But do we have that luxury? In terms of what type of leader we need a leader who is willing to fail and publicly willing to admit that I'm going to have failures. X things will blow up, X number of things won't work, I'm going to own them. But I am not going to run a government that is so scared of failure that I will not take serious measures or try to address a situation that is dynamic, changing, unprecedented, generational change in the U.S. where we don't know what's going to come out will require risk, and it will lead to failures in policy. But you cannot succeed if you cannot fail. And I think that's what's really been holding Canada back. This fear of failure, fear of having to deal with the media coming after you for a risk, a calculated risk, an intelligent risk that didn't pan out. Until we have a leader that's willing to embrace failure, as weird as that sounds, I don't think we're going to break our current rut. I worked for a U.S. government agency who had as its mission statement that it would fail occasionally. So governments can do this. We did this. We had in our mission statement that we would fail because our job was to take risk, to test new ideas. So I don't want to hear that governments can't do this, the political calculation is wrong, the public won't accept this. I think if you're upfront about it as a leader, that's what we're looking for. Someone who's actually got the guts to say, this is difficult, I'm not going to be perfect, I'm going to fail, but I'm going to do so in an attempt to move the country. Anyway, there you go. Stump speech for somebody.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Nick, you get the last word.
In politics, we so often talk about the electability of leaders from a sense of, would someone want to have a drink with them? That needs to end. We don't need to elect our friend. We don't need to elect our buddy. We need to elect an adult. To put a finer point on what both Carlo and Tyler have talked about, and I completely agree with, we need a serious person who has serious experience and serious knowledge and is not afraid to seriously do nation building hard things, not talk about it, not wax poetic, but then be, to Carlo's point, afraid of the backlash. Let's take interprovincial trade, right, as an example. That can go away, easily. It's not too easy, don't get me wrong. But if you're committed and if you're serious and if you're not afraid of Alberta getting in your face about it or New Brunswick or working out all of these other issues, you can get it done. And so someone who is seriously committed to change but is just serious in general is the type of leader that we need in the face of a world where our southern neighbor is deeply unserious as a leader. And we have European leaders who are so serious that they're taking us back to 1930s, 1940s with some of these opposition parties that are coming up. You can stand in the face of that and you can build up Canada. That's the leader that Canadians need right now.
That's a great note from all three of you on which to end today's conversation. Thank you, Tyler, Carlo, and Nick, for your time and your perspective. I hope you found this episode as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. Remember, these Fireside Chats with Erin are monthly, so mark your calendars. We'll be back next month with another great conversation. Stay connected with us for more engaging conversations that delve into the heart of the grain industry. You can catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Just search for Fireside Chats with Erin and hit the subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. Until next time.